So one of the difficult things is that you want a class always to be interactive, and it's a little bit difficult on Zoom. Actually, maybe Susan, do you want to remind people how they know how to mute and unmute, but maybe about raising the hand
Okay,
if they
so
want.
at the bottom center of your screen, if you'll pull your cursor down, you get to participants. And if you click on that, a little pop-up will come up. And at the bottom there, you will have a raise hand icon you can click on, which will let you raise your hand. And Dinah and I will be trying to monitor that. You can also put a question in the chat if you want to wait till Rabbi Stern has gotten to a point where questions make sense. And if you have any questions, you can put something in the chat and we will try and help you out.
Right, and it'd be hard for me to monitor it. I have it on, but it'll be hard for me to monitor it. But somehow I will learn, and I will be asking for questions. I'm also going to be once in a while asking for somebody to volunteer to read. And what I would suggest is, if you're willing to volunteer to read, you just unmute yourself and start reading, and hopefully not more than 6 people will read at this. No, somebody will be first, and just a way for people to participate. So right before we start climbing this mountain, let's recite the bracha for study, which is up on the screen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Holy One, who has commanded us with the mitzvah to immerse ourselves in words of Torah. Behar, as was mentioned in the, I guess in the written description, has a famous phrase in it that Philadelphians certainly know, and that anybody that studied American history would know. So I'm going to turn this over to Dinah for a little bit of introduction to that. And Susan, I think you can unscreen us here. Oh,
You want me to do
no,
what?
go ahead. Susan,
Do I go ahead?
go. Yeah, go
Okay.
ahead, Susan, thanks.
Okay. So as George mentioned, and as anyone who's familiar with the Liberty Bell may remember, it is inscribed with words from this Torah portion from Leviticus: proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. And what I did not realize until I was reading about the Liberty Bell a little bit last night is that the Pennsylvania Assembly at the time ordered those words inscribed, or ordered the bell to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Penn's charter, or essentially the Pennsylvania Constitution at the time. And so those 50 years, as we'll read in today's Torah portion, are a significant number. And the Liberty Bell, although ordered up in the mid-1700s, became a very important symbol during slavery for abolitionists. And that also relates, I think, to our Torah portion today, which touches on freedom for servants. And so with that, I'll give it back to George.
Okay, great. So we're only going to be looking at really the first part of the Torah portion. And it begins right here. It's from Leviticus 25. By the way, in Orthodox synagogues and in some conservative synagogues and a few Reform synagogues, they have morning services, and on Monday and Thursday you would read Torah, and the part that would be read today is this section. So it Well, so that's it. If someone would be willing to start our reading, you don't have to read the numbers; those are the verse numbers. Just unmute yourself and start reading. We'll hear you.
Adonai spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, do it all. Yeah.
Speak to the Israelite people and say to them, when you enter the land that I assign you, the land shall observe a Sabbath of Adonai. 6 years you may sow your field, and 6 years you may prune your vineyard and gather the yield. But in the 7th year, the land shall have a Sabbath of complete rest, a Sabbath of... I'm having a problem because the pictures are cutting off the end.
Adonai.
Adonai.
Yeah.
Adonai, you shall not sow your field or prune your vineyard. You shall not reap the aftergrowth of your harvest or gather the grapes of your untrimmed vines. It shall be a year of complete rest for the land. But you may eat whatever the land during its Sabbath will produce, you, your male and female slaves, the hired and bound laborers who live with you, and your cattle and the beasts in your land may eat all its yield.
Okay, so that's the first part.
Oh, thank you. I tried to.
Thank you, Gretchen. Thank you very much.
Oh.
That's the first part of the first section of the Parsha, and it's about the Shemitah year. Shemitah is this year where the land lays fallow. What questions or issues does this section raise for you? Just if you've got something to say, unmute yourself and say it and then remute yourself. What does it raise for you? You are Jews. That means you talk.
Well, one thing, it assumes that you have slaves.
It assumes that there are slaves. Is that what you said?
Yes. Yes.
Yes, it does. In just so you know, in the Bible, slave is frequently I think often better thought of as like an indentured servant, but it does assume, and here it also talks about hired and bound laborers. So the slaves were probably not Jews, Hebrews, and the hired and bound laborers were. But yes, it does assume that, and that's an issue. So you could see why this portion became important to, even though we haven't read the Proclaim Liberty part yet, this portion became very significant actually for abolitionists.
George, it's Malka, Gail speaking.
Sure.
So everybody's doing it on the same cycle, right? It's not my own personal 7-year cycle and it's different from my neighbors. Is that?
It is right. It is all on the same cycle. And by the way, it is still, it is noted, it is celebrated or commemorated in Israel, in amongst parts of the population, always in the same year as a couple of years ago. Oh, let's shut that up.
So,
Anybody else?
Yeah, I have a question.
Sure.
Agriculturally,
Yeah.
have they found that this is truly a benefit to the crops? I mean, how has that been tested from a scientific? I'm asking that from a scientific standpoint.
I do know that, you know, if you keep planting the same crops in the same place year after year, the soil sort of gets worn out. And one of the ways that farmers deal with that is that they rotate crops. They put different crops in different places. But listen, it's also why we use fertilizer. Because if you don't do something like this, then the soil loses its potency and its ability to get things to grow. I can't answer your sort of scientific question and whether a year, you know, or a few months here. But remember, agriculture goes in year cycles. So if you plant barley in the spring and wheat a little bit later, or whatever your pattern is, then going a whole year means that all of those crops and the vineyards get a chance to kind of rest. But I didn't anticipate the question, and somebody ought to look it up.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the answer to Gail's question. Was everybody on the same schedule?
Yes,
Okay, thank you.
And
that would
do
have
you know
been.
if this is still practiced in Israel?
It is practiced among some of the very orthodox communities, agricultural communities. Yeah.
George,
Yes.
what
Just-
what always strikes me about this part of the Torah and certain others is the idea that your land it's your land, but it's ultimately God's land.
Great. And that will become even more obvious in the next section that we're going to look at some other texts, but when we read the next verses, when we talk about the Yovel, the Jubilee year, that becomes really obvious. But there's a the biblical notion is that the land is God's. So that has real implications about the issue of ownership. And that obviously has economic implications that we'll get to talk about even more as we go through. But if we're climbing out of this mountain that we're sort of at the foot of, or maybe we've gotten a little bit of the ways up in the last couple of months, and we want to think about the future, when we get to the top, what do we want the society at the top to look like? And you can certainly draw some conclusions, I think, from this particular biblical text. Let's go to the next screen.
George, before we go, just a thought.
Oh, sure. I'm sorry.
The quiet that it implies, that everything sort of stops.
Yes.
Look around.
We're having a kind of, yes, Shemitah, which, good. Is this easy to do? Think about that. How this must be difficult. I would assume that there would be some worry about what people can eat. On the other hand, if you were somebody who is a laborer, you're someone who's poor, or someone that doesn't have land, you have access to food in a more equally than you would during the intervening 6 years. So one group in society might see itself as benefiting, and another group might see itself as losing out. Because remember, you can eat, but you've got nothing to sell. You can't sell even what grows on its own. You just use it. You may eat all its yield, but you don't get to use it, you as the landowner, the farmer owner. Let's look at a couple of texts. By the way, when you unmute yourself, could you say who you are? Because I can't see all your faces. So in the future, if you do that. Kli Yakar, as you see, is a 16th century rabbi. Let's see what he says about the Shemitah year. If somebody wants to quick unmute and read it. Great.
The Shemitah year this is Bonnie Silverman.
Okay.
The Shemitah year promotes a sense of fellowship and peace through the suspension of cultivation, even for the needy of your people, for one is not allowed to exercise private ownership over any of the seventh year produce. And this is undoubtedly a primary factor in promoting peace, since most dissension originates from the attitudes of mine is mine, one person claiming it's all mine, and the other also claiming it is all mine. But in the seventh year, all are equal, and that is the real essence of peace. Do you want me to read the question?
Well, sure.
So according to the Kli Yakar, what is the purpose or consequence of Shemitah? Can you imagine it playing out in this way?
Anybody want to respond to that or just to what you read? And notice that this is obviously what we'd say an Orthodox commentary. It's from the 16th century, when Jews in Europe were often living in very difficult situations, medieval situations. Anybody want to?
This is Marilyn Essner, and I have a question.
Sure.
Did people prepare for the Shemitah year? Did they say next year we're going to be in trouble, so let's do this or that?
I have not read any, although I have not read any descriptions of preparation for it. But it would seem to me that people might do that. They could squirrel away things, even if you were the farmer that owned the land, you might, keep some crops aside rather than sell them so that you would know that your family had enough to eat. But I haven't read any descriptions that would corroborate that. And of course, if you were poor, there's no prep that you could do, really.
George,
Yeah.
this is Dinah.
Hi, Dinah.
Hi. This commentary just is so striking that this was written, 400 something years ago. It could have been a New York Times op-ed yesterday. It's, no justice, no peace. And we're living in a time of mine, mine, mine. I worked for what I got. If you can't afford health insurance, too bad for you, and it just speaks right to that. It's not all yours, and you didn't get it all by yourself. God gave whatever you have.
God gave you the land.
Yeah, whether it's the land or your in this era, your income, someone else, you're blessed. It's not all you, and someone is also working for you as well.
Mm-hmm. And remember that everyone, this year affects everybody. As I said, some would view it maybe as not as positively as others, because the one that says mine is mine and it's all mine, well, but it's a great reminder. Let's look at the next slide or page. This is even older. Somebody want to read something that is 1,500 years old? And the question would be, how are they defining might or mighty? And how would we define it? Somebody want to unmute and do it? From Psalm 103:20 is the little quote. Hey, Susan, you want to do it? We said you could do one.
Yes,
Or
I had
more.
to unmute myself.
Yeah.
We read in Psalms 103:20, the mighty in strength that fulfill his word. To whom does the scripture refer? Rabbi Isaac said, to those who are willing to observe the sabbatical year. In the way of the world, a man may be willing to observe a commandment for a day, a week, a month, but is he likely to continue to do so through the remaining days of the year? Wow, makes me think of right now. But throughout the Shemitah year, this mighty man sees his field declared ownerless, his fences broken down, and his produce consumed by others. Yet he continues to give up his produce without saying a word. Can you conceive a person mightier than such as he?
So might is described how here? What makes a person mighty? And of course we could say he or she.
Well, this sounds to me as if the term would be righteous.
Okay, so might is not described in terms of power, of being able to have power over someone, but doing the right thing. I think that's what you're saying.
Yes, yeah.
So might is righteous. Anybody else?
This sounds, this is Marilyn. This sounds like a lot of chaos. It doesn't sound like a system with any kind of regulations that make sure that people aren't trampling on each other and trying to grab the good stuff. Could you comment on that?
Maybe somebody else wants to comment on it, because I think you're raising an important question. Or I'll ask back, what does this statement assume to be the case about the society in which this is happening?
George, this is
Yeah.
Dinah.
Yeah.
Well, I think it assumes everyone's on the same page,
Mhm.
and or at least there's an expectation that, you know, every landowner will be doing this. So there will be plenty, and people will behave. And in terms of the mighty, I that might also be spiritual power,
Mhm.
that they understand that this is a holy thing and commanded
Right.
to do.
Yeah.
And sometimes if you have spiritual power and understanding, it's easier to do that hard thing. It's easier to do the fast on Yom Kippur if you are thinking about what it means instead of, oh, this is just a day I have to do this.
Mhm. Yep. Anyone else before we go on?
Yes.
This is Ellen Poster.
Hi.
Hi. To me, it made me think about power in the sense of power over yourself. I think it's talking about having self-discipline, to give up your produce without saying a word. But I also have a question. When you did the first verse, I thought it was saying that the only people who could eat what was there was your own household, and this seems to be saying that anybody could go on your land. So
That's
could you
correct.
explain that?
It is not just your household. It is anyone. That's why here it talks about his fences are broken down. I don't know that that needs to be taken literally, but it means they're open.
Thank you.
George,
Yeah.
Gail. So what I'm envisioning is a bunch of squatters coming and sort of making themselves at home on your land. So it would take a lot of forbearance. That's the might, discipline of self to say, you know what? Yep, that you belong here. There's a movie. It's a black and white movie, so it must be from the 30s or 40s. And I don't remember it, but about a squatter who brings in all sorts of people into a Fifth Avenue mansion in New York City. And even the owner who comes back sort of plays along. So I'm sorry, I don't know the title, but it's the same idea.
Okay. By the way, these laws are the rabbis by the 6th century when this is written. These laws were said to only apply in Eretz Yisrael. So they did not apply to Jews living elsewhere. And I think that that is partially a recognition of how difficult this would be, especially if you're living in a society where different people have different customs and you're in, I don't want to say competition, but if you're a farmer, everybody is not following the same rules. So this only applied in Israel. And today in Israel, it doesn't apply to everybody.
When you think of fences metaphorically, and you think of fences as meaning boundaries of all sorts, and when you think of how important boundaries are to maintaining some semblance of order, then it does seem like everything is going to hell in a handbasket.
Well, potentially it could. And of course, that's why we have laws. And by the way, as is always the case, the biblical texts are only, they're really like outlines often. So all of these laws have to be explained. That's the purpose of Midrash. It's the purpose of the Mishnah, which was the law code of around the year 200, and then the Talmud, because if you and we have to assume that even before any of those texts were available, there were plenty of other rules and regulations that would define how all of this can work for people. By the way, that's why regulations are important. Not everything is a law, but you have the regulation that helps you to understand how to fulfill the law.
So do you think that the farmer was saying, now everybody line up and I'll let 2 of you in at a time and you take what you want and then the next 2 people can come in, or anything like that?
I have no idea. Wouldn't have been a bad system, would it?
No.
Because it doesn't let anybody run in, and probably you should time it so nobody can go in and get all the toilet paper. You're limited, and people share. It's a different sort of society or assumption about society. One more to take a look at. Rabbi Tzvi Hersher. Now, he is an Orthodox rabbi, but a Zionist, a pioneer Zionist, as you see in Germany. So he is going to be looking at this as a rabbi, modern enough that they're thinking about Jews going back into the land, but he's not living there. Somebody want to read it?
I'll read.
Great.
The
Karen with me.
Shemitah year.
Oh,
I'm Muriel.
Go ahead.
Yeah, go, Muro.
The Shemitah year teaches us further that the rich should not lord it over the poor, according to the Torah ordained. I can't see the end, so it's
accordingly. Can you can slot? You can actually, if you because you got pictures. I think if
I
you
have everyone's photos.
Okay. Great. Okay.
So accordingly, the Torah ordained that all should be equal during the 7th year. Both the rich and the needy have access to the gardens and fields to eat their fill. Yet another reason, in order that they should not always be preoccupied with working the soil to provide for their material needs, for in this 1 year, they would be completely free. The liberation from the yoke of work would give them the opportunity for studying Torah and wisdom. The unlettered, illiterate will be occupied with crafts and building and supplying the needs of Eretz Yisrael. Those endowed with special skills will invent new methods in this free time for the benefit of the world. That's interesting.
So somebody had mentioned before that there are spiritual dimensions to all of this. And here Rabbi Hersher makes that very clear. If you're busy working all the time, you don't have time. You don't stop to think. You don't stop to pray, to meditate, to think more philosophically about your own life, about the lives of your family, and the effect of everything that's going on the society as a whole. So, by the way, the unlettered or illiterate, that's not, he doesn't mean that negatively at all. But he's saying, obviously, the people that can't read aren't going to be studying Torah, but they can contribute as well. They have crafts. They can build, and of course, if they're in Israel, or in Eretz Yisrael, they can help supply the needs there and come up with new ideas. Jews, we have, if we, when we're able to take it seriously, we can do some of this every week on the Sabbath. But here, it's society-wide. Of course, it's assuming, well, it's assuming it's a Jewish society, but the non-Jews are also included in all of this. Of course, but it's a majority Jewish, and it's not just for a day a week. It's for and as one of the preceding text said, could you imagine? You do certain things for a day, even a week, maybe even a month, like Ramadan for Muslims, but this is a year. So why don't we just go on?
George?
Yeah, we have a question. Go ahead.
This is Dinah. And it's hard to talk about any silver linings about what's going on now because so many people are suffering. So I wanted to, say that first. However, for those of us who are, semi-quarantining at home, we're kind of experiencing some of this to an extent, and we have a whole society and even world doing it at the same time, where it's not even just your family doing this.
Mm-hmm.
And it really gives you a certain amount of time and just a different perspective of not running around, and even for the kids, not having to be at practice, not having to be at school at 8 a.m, physically at school at 8 a.m, and suddenly you're talking to people long distance, face to face, who you wouldn't because you'd be so busy just running around doing your thing. So, it's a different situation, but there is something to that.
And I guess that raises gets us to think about what do we want to see that's different when we get to the top of the mountain? When we are freed from all of these sort of mandatory and quasi-mandatory restrictions, but want to see what can we do to capture and maintain those aspects of all of this that are the silver lining. Because if they're a silver lining now, they could be a silver lining, also in the future. Just look at. I'll read just one. Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Susan, I have a comment too. I guess one of the things in the last reading, it talks about everyone being equal.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think about right now, look at the list of the people who are defined as essential workers. Who are they? Some maybe are who you think, some are not. And hopefully we can come out of this with that in mind.
George?
Yes. Yes. Yeah. I'm sorry. Yeah. Any other comments or questions? I didn't.
Yeah. Well, I had my hand up. I don't know who's doing the hand raise thing.
I know.
I'm supposed to do that, but I'm not seeing any raised hands for some reason. So.
It's Adele Rubin.
Okay. Well, then Adele and anyone else, just talk. Try to do one at a time.
Because you've gone down to the next.
We can go back. You want to go back?
But it's okay. It occurred to me that this idea that the liberation from the yoke of work would give them opportunity for studying Torah and wisdom, and et cetera, that this is almost the derivation of taking, at least in the academic world, of taking a sabbatical.
And in English, by the way, this is the sabbatical year.
Yeah. So, I mean, but that's the whole purpose of faculty, professors going off to write a book or to do some research or to just get away from the, the daily grind of preparing classes, teaching them, dealing with students, et cetera. So it was just something that it occurred to me that really is a parallel.
And imagine if there was some parallel for the quote essential workers, most of whom many of whom are poorly paid,
right,
and who could only take time off if somebody paid them to do it. So, yeah, absolutely.
Right. That was one thing I wanted to add, is that not everyone has the opportunity to do what we're doing right now.
Right.
You know,
They,
and are having to choose between working and having a living, and possibly exposing themselves to something.
yeah, absolutely. Anyone else before we move on? I want to, okay. Let's go to the next screen. And I just want to, this is a kind of a more spiritual approach, but take a look at just at the very beginning. The treasure of the nation, that's the Jewish people. And Rav Kook is one of the, he is the first Ashkenazic chief rabbi in Israel. And he was somewhat of a mystic. The treasure of the nation, the divine blessing that is implanted in it, the order of the world, the righteous and good life, lived in harmony with justice and honesty, peace and tranquility, grace and courage, permeated by the all-embracing contemplation of the divine purpose as it exists in the national soul, these cannot be activated in the day-to-day life. The very nature of this life obfuscates the spiritual majesty of the divine soul which dwells in the nation and prevents its bright and shining light from penetrating the profane reality. Profane is not negative, it's the other 6 days of the week, or the other 6 years. You could say. So this is reinforcing, the last sentence of the next paragraph. What the Sabbath achieves regarding the individual, the Shemitah achieves with regard to the nation as a whole. Because, often when we're dealing with, let's say, social justice issues, we're dealing with activism. We say, well, what can one person do? And this is a recognition. Well, one person can affect him or herself and some other people. But here you had a year, and it was to affect the nation as a whole. Okay, let's go. Any comments before we move on?
Yeah, this is Bonnie, also known as Basia.
Okay.
So this is assuming that everyone is following the rules, and everyone and who is leading this besides Hashem? I mean, just Rabbi, just from your studies, I wonder if you.
Well, if this is being carried out, it's being carried out under the leadership, the national leadership. But I do think that you're dealing here with a society that was easier to keep on the same page. In Israel, right today, my brother-in-law and his family live there, and they're in Tel Aviv, and they have been describing what's been going on in Israel around this coronavirus. They really locked down the whole country. Now, obviously, it's easier to do that in Israel than it is in the United States. Israel's the size of New Jersey, but New Jersey has more people in it than Israel does. But everything was closed essentially. They were not supposed to go more than 100 meters from their house for several weeks, except to go shopping, to grocery shopping, or grocery shopping, or some emergency, a medical emergency. And people listened, people did it. Our society is much more difficult to control. And we've had this individualistic strain, since the beginning of society. It was reinforced during the days of, moving westward. And we still have an awful lot of people in this country, who think that, it's fine to protest these regulations. even with guns. And I shouldn't say an awful lot. But that represents a certain group and a certain mindset in our country, and you have people who believe that individuals can control everything about their lives, and if they're having a hard time, it's their fault. That's why we have such problem with a social net, because we don't, as a nation, we haven't gotten to the point yet, and maybe never will, where we believe that there's really a safety net that we have an obligation to maintain. So
Well,
I
I
think,
think it's,
yeah,
oh, just one comment, that we have an obligation to each other.
yes,
That's really what's missing as
yeah,
a nation, not in, I mean, certainly as individuals, there have been, heroic beyond, beyond heroic
sure, oh yeah, yeah,
actions. But, if you look at people not necessarily always protesting in a group, but yeah, there isn't an overall belief in taking care of the other.
yeah. It's yeah, well, it's like the wearing of the masks, the face coverings. Some people do, some people don't. Well, that's not helpful to the society as a whole. I want to look at the next Torah portion, next section. So let's go to it. This is the Jubilee year. And if you think what we've been reading is tough, we're going to take a look at this. Somebody wants to unmute and read? Great. Go. Whoever said it, do it.
Okay. Jane Friedman,
Great.
you shall count off 7 weeks of years, 7 times 7 years, so that the period of 7 weeks of years gives you a total of 49 years. Number 9, then you shall sound the horn loud. In the 7th month, on the 10th day of the month, the day of atonement, you shall have the horn sounded throughout your land. 10, and you shall hallow the 50th year. You shall proclaim release throughout the land for all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. Each of you shall return to your holding, and each of you shall return to your family. 11, that 50th year shall be a jubilee for you. You shall now sow, neither shall you reap the aftergrowth of harvest or harvest the untrimmed vines. 12, for it is a jubilee. It shall be holy to you. You may only eat the growth direct from the field. 13, in this jubilee, each of you shall return to his holding. 14, when you sell property to your neighbor or buy any from your neighbor, you shall not wrong one another. 15, in buying from your neighbor, you shall deduct only for the number of years since the Jubilee, and in selling for you, he shall charge you only for the remaining crop years. 16, the more such years, the higher the price you pay. The fewer the years, the lower the price. For what he is selling you is a number of harvests. 17, do not wrong one another, but fear your God. For I, Adonai, am your God. 18, you shall observe my laws and faithfully keep my rules, that you may live upon, that's okay. You may live upon the land in security. 19, the land shall yield its fruit, and you shall eat your fill, and you shall live upon it in security.
All right. What does this raise for you? What is this about? Focus for a moment, verse 10. You shall proclaim, the Liberty Bell says liberty throughout the land. Here it says release. What's going on here?
Release.
What's happening to what, or if you want to, beginning in verse 14, 15, 16, about selling property or to any selling property and buying it, you deduct the number of years since the Jubilee, charge only the years until the Jubilee. What is that?
George, this is Ellen.
Go ahead.
To me, it's making it sound like at the end of 50 years, the land reverts back.
Yes.
So in other words, when you sell it, it's really for like a 50-year lease, and then it reverts back to the previous owner. It also reminds me so much of the counting of the Omer between Passover and Shavuot, also
Yes.
49. Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. So this is pretty amazing. In its origin, it wasn't about, when we think of proclaiming liberty throughout the land, when that landed on the Liberty Bell, that was really talking about what we would probably call freedom. It wasn't talking about property. This is talking about property. Rabbis, some of the scholars will talk about the concept of eminent domain, and what they mean by that is, well, we have it in American law, eminent domain. That's when a government can take property from someone for some public use. Here, the one that owned it was God. Remember in the Bible, God divvies up the land to the different tribes and then the clans within the tribes. If necessary, somebody might want to, quote, sell land, but notice what it said in verse 16, for what he is selling you is a number of harvests. You're not really selling the land. You can't sell the land because it's not yours to sell. That's what those verses are trying to say. Because in the 50th year, it all goes back. So if there's only 3 years to go, you can't charge as much as you would if there were 46 years to go, where somebody would, be able to benefit from the harvest.
Number 14.
Yeah.
It says, when you sell property to your neighbor or buy any from your neighbor, you shall not wrong one another. I thought we weren't wronging one another ever.
Oh, well, yeah, but here it's talking about property. And so what are the property rights that somebody has? What do you own permanently, as it were, in this society as it's maybe that's not a clear question.
Maybe you own whatever it is you've built on the land, which is not yours. So if you have a house that you built, that house is yours.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know the answer to that. But
George?
you own your clothes. You own certain stuff, but you don't own property. And because property is what one might say creates the most division. Somebody just said my name, so they must have.
I did, Dinah.
Dinah.
I think you have the right to produce on that land, and whatever grows on that land
is yours except in the 7th year.
Except in the 7th year, and it is still God's land.
Yep.
And it's interesting to me that God does want that land to be somewhat yours, to go back to you eventually, even if you sell these rights to other people. But ultimately, you have a right to have a life, to sustain yourself and your family through your land. Mm-hmm. But it's ultimately still God's land.
Yeah. Anybody else? What do you think about this? Is there anything like this that we see in our society or could see in our society. Doesn't have to, and maybe it doesn't have to do with land per se, but what would be another way, what would be a modern way to understand this? Somebody I think is speaking, but I can't hear.
I think some of it is background.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking, this is Basia Bani. I was thinking, if you live in a condominium, you own your unit, your apartment. I guess in that sense, you do own a percentage of the land, but you don't own the entire. You own a portion of what you have purchased.
And there are rules about
Yes,
use.
there are definitely rules. Yeah, yeah. Some good, some but yeah. But and it's interesting because if you break the rules, there are repercussions. Now, sometimes it may be difficult to hold someone to those breaking the rules. Sometimes you can't identify, for example, who's making the noise, but there are rules. But yet our society as a whole, some of the smaller things like disturbing your neighbor, that's very hard to enforce. Except, let's say, maybe some cities will, if people honk their horns, there's a fine. But as a whole, some of these nuances are very difficult, if impossible, to enforce. So I think I mean, I'm just taking it there. It's not necessarily addressing it here, but just kind of taking it one step further.
This is Mark. There's a huge political implication for this right now in terms of the question about what someone who is a business, someone who owns a business is entitled to in that regard. There was a lot of talk, Obama got in a lot of trouble for saying, you didn't build that, you took advantage of common things, like you took advantage of infrastructure that we've all contributed to and so forth. He wasn't talking about God, he was talking about this society as a whole. I think by implication that this may be your business, but you only are able to have it because of things that all of us in society have contributed to. It's not quite the same thing as saying it belongs to God, but it has implications for the kind of responsibility that you have for how you dispose of your business, how you run it. And a lot of people don't buy that. People, well, I don't know if it's a lot, but that is certainly something we've been fighting about.
George, can I just, this is Ellen. Yeah, I agree with that too, Dinah. And I think it relates to how we treat land. When we pollute, when we are not careful about the environment, that also affects everybody. And it helps me understand the very first verse you put up, where it was saying that it was a Shabbat of the land. And I was thinking to myself, it's talking about people having rest every 7 years. And this is talking about somehow the land having rest. But I think this is talking about the land, that there's a sort of holiness about the land itself. And I think that's a really interesting way to think about pollution and the environment and care of our water and land and all of that. So I think it's very contemporary in that way.
I see two comments from Gail. One was to say that the movie that was being talked about before is called It Happened on Fifth Avenue. Maybe if you're interested, you can go find it. And Gail also said, I can't think of any contemporary situation in which we hit reset as completely as described in this portion. Let's take a look. Let's go to the 10th skip the next one and go to the 10th as a wrap up. Jonathan Sacks was for a number of years, till a few years ago, the chief rabbi of Britain. And I find his writing to be amazing. He's an Orthodox Jew, obviously, but very contemporary in many, many ways. And I'd like to read through this. This one I'll read because it can almost be my summary. The legislation in Parshat Behar represents the architectonics of a just society. It tells us that an economic system must exist within a moral framework. It need not aim at economic equality, but it must respect human dignity. No one should become permanently imprisoned in the chains of debt. No one should be deprived of a stake in the Commonwealth. Parenthetically, it's always struck me that our state is called a Commonwealth, but the way our laws are and the way our legislature frequently acts, they don't think about what does it mean to be a Commonwealth. Going on here, no one should be a slave to his or her employer. Everyone has the right, 1 day in 7, 1 year in 7, to respite from the endless pressures of work. Going down to the next paragraph. Leviticus 25 creates a mechanism whose aim is to correct the tendencies toward radical and ever-increasing inequality that result from the unfettered play of free market economics. So you see what he's doing is he's applying this directly to our situation. In biblical times, they didn't have free reigning economics, because unfettered economics, because land reverted to the original owner. There is the sabbatical year in which debts are released. By the way, that's because when you get back to your land, there no longer are debts. Slaves are set free. We didn't read all of this. The land lies fallow, and its produce not to be harvested belongs to everyone. Next paragraph. And I like this statement. Poverty is not a blessed or divinely ordained condition. It is, the rabbis say, a kind of death, and worse than 50 plagues. And they say nothing is harder to bear than poverty, because he who is crushed by poverty is like one to whom all the troubles of the world cling, and upon whom all the curses of Deuteronomy, in another parsha, another portion, have descended. If all troubles were placed on one side and poverty on the other, poverty would outweigh them all. And he then writes, as I write, inequalities have increased dramatically in most market economies in the past decade. And he wrote this a couple of years ago. At such times, we need to be acutely aware of the responsibilities wealth brings to alleviate the condition of the poor. That flows directly from the principle of eminent domain, that what we possess, we do not own. We merely hold it in trust from God, or we might say, what we have built, what we have because society has set up structures that have made it possible for us to have it. The roads, in order to build a mansion, you need to have roads that transport the materials that you need for that house. Building a business, there are laws, there are rules that make it possible for people to build a business. You don't do it, as somebody said earlier, all on your own. And from a spiritual sense, we merely hold it in trust from God. And one of the conditions of that trust is that those who have more than they need should share their blessings with those who have significantly less. That is why, and here's a key, tzedakah in Judaism means justice, not merely charity. So I think that gives us some sense of how this parsha, this climbing of the mountain, can be, could lead to some visions that would enable us to avoid some of the terrible consequences that we've just that we continue to experience, where people in poorer neighborhoods are more likely to have the disease, where people who are lucky enough to work but in jobs that often have poor wages are more likely to contract the disease. I don't need to go through this. You read it or you hear it every day. So it seemed to me that this was an unbelievably relevant parsha for us to be talking about at this, at this juncture. It is a little bit past 11. I think Susan has a few things to share.
All right, so thank you all for attending this first session.
Yes, I thank you too. Yeah, I'm sorry.
I have pasted in the link for the evaluation is in the chat. We'd ask that everybody please copy that to their URL and go do the evaluation for this session.
And if you don't see that chat, you don't have the chat, if you go to the RS webpage, rodashalom.org/, then we'll look for new days of learning, and in there you will find about the evaluation. Sorry.
I'm going to stop the recording here.